Hello, my lovely friends. It's Emma from A Vintage Girl in a Modern World. You know, there are some people who leave behind more than wonderful films. They leave behind a feeling that stays with us long after the credits are rolled. And for me, Audrey Hepburn has always been one of those people. Whenever I watch one of her films, I don't simply see a beautiful actress. I see kindness, grace, warmth, quiet strength, and somebody who seemed to carry herself with such a gentleness that feels incredibly rare today. Whenever people think of Audrey Hepburn, they often think of elegance, the little black dress, the pearls, the beautiful clothes, the unforgettable photographs. And of course, all those things became part of what made Audrey so iconic. But I have to be honest, the older I've become, the more I've realised that what inspires me most isn't the glamour. It's the woman behind it. Because underneath all that timeless style was somebody who cared deeply about other people. Someone who never seemed interested in shouting the loudest or demanding attention. She simply seemed happy being herself. And I think there's something rather wonderful about that. Because for as long as I can remember, I've loved old films. Not because they're old, but because of the way they make me feel. Comforted, inspired, at home. And whenever I watch Audrey Hepburn, I find myself slowing down. The world somehow becomes a little quieter, a little kinder, and for a couple of hours I'm reminded that grace and kindness never really go out of fashion. Now, of course, this isn't going to be a biography of Audrey Hepburn. There are plenty of places you can go if you're looking for every date, every film, and every detail of her remarkable life. Today, I simply want to spend a little time talking about why Audrey still inspires me. Why her films continue to captivate new generations. Why her kindness continues to shine through all these years later. And why whenever I spend time watching Audrey Hepburn, I'm reminded that true elegance has very little to do with clothes. And everything to do with the way we treat people. The more I've thought about this episode, the more I've realised that what makes Audrey Hepburn so special isn't actually her beauty. Now, before anybody gasps, of course she was beautiful. She remains one of the most beautiful women to ever appear on a cinema screen. But beauty alone doesn't explain why people still adore her all these years later. Because there has been countless beautiful actresses, yet very few continue to inspire generation after generation, in quite the same way that Audrey does. And I think that's because there was something much deeper about her. And whenever I watch Audrey, I don't simply notice the way she looks. I notice the way she carries herself. There is a quiet confidence about her. A gentleness, a kindness. She never seems as though she's trying to prove anything. She simply seems comfortable being herself. And I have to be honest, I find that incredibly refreshing. In today's world where so much seems to revolve around being louder, faster, and constantly trying to stand out, Audrey reminds us that there is real strength in quietness, real strength in kindness, real strength in humility. And whenever I see old interviews of Audrey, I'm always struck by how softly she spoke, how thoughtfully she answered questions. She never appeared interested in becoming the centre of attention, even though she easily could have been. There was something so wonderfully grounded about her. And perhaps that's one of the reasons she still feels so relevant today. Because I always say that genuine kindness never really goes out of fashion. And the older I've become, the more I've realised that the people I admire most aren't necessarily the loudest people in the room. They're the people who make others feel comfortable. The people who leave you feeling a little bit happier after you spent time with them. And somehow, that's exactly how Audrey has always made me feel. Even through a television screen. And I think that's rather remarkable. Because not everybody leaves that kind of legacy behind. Some people are remembered for what they achieved. Some are remembered for what they owned. Some are remembered because they were famous. But Audrey Hepburn is remembered because she made people feel something. Warmth, hope, kindness, and honestly, I think that's one of the loveliest things anyone could be remembered for. Whenever people ask me where to start with Audrey Hepburn, I always find myself saying the same thing. Roman Holiday. Honestly, I don't think I'll ever grow tired of that film. I've been completely mad about Audrey for years, and every time I watch Roman Holiday, I'm reminded exactly why. Because there's something so wonderfully charming about it. And from the very first moment Audrey appears on the screen, you can't help but fall in love with her. She has that rare ability to make you feel every emotion right alongside her. You smile when she smiles. Your heart aches when hers does. And before you know it, you're completely swept up in the story. Of course, Gregory Peck was the perfect leading man, and together they created something that feels every bit as magical today as it did when audiences first saw it. But what I love most about Roman Holiday isn't simply the romance. It's the feeling the film leaves you with. The beautiful streets of Rome, the little cafes, the Vespers, the elegant clothes, the laughter, the adventure. And every time I watch it, I find myself wishing I could step straight through the screen and spend an afternoon wandering those streets. And that's the thing I love most about old films. They don't simply tell us a story, they invite us into another world. And Audrey had an extraordinary gift for making those worlds feel real. And whenever I watch Roman Holiday, I don't feel as though I'm watching a performance. I feel as though I'm spending time with someone genuine, someone curious, someone kind, someone finding joy in life's simplest moments. And I have to be honest, I think that's why the film has remained one of my favourites for so many years. Because every time I return to it, I notice something new. A smile, a glance, a little beautiful moment that somehow escaped me. And somehow it still leaves me smiling every single time. Now, of course, we can't talk about Audrey Hepburn without mentioning Breakfast at Tiffany's. It's one of those films that has become part of popular culture. Even people who have never seen the film instantly recognise Audrey standing outside Tiffany's in that beautiful black dress. And I have to be honest, it's easy to understand why. She looks effortlessly elegant. But whenever I watch Breakfast at Tiffany's, I'm reminded that Audrey was so much more than a fashion icon. She had an incredible ability to make us care about the people she played. There was always a vulnerability beneath the glamour, a warmth, a humanity. And I think that's why her performances have stood the test of time. The same is true when I watch films like Sabrina or Funny Face. Each one has its own charm, its own personality. Yet somehow Audrey remained unmistakably Audrey. She never felt as though she was trying to be somebody she wasn't. She simply brought a little bit of herself to every role she played. And perhaps that's one of the reasons audiences trusted her. Because she felt genuine. And I've always believed that the very best actors don't simply perform. They make you believe. They make you forget you're watching a film. And I believe that Audrey had that gift. Because whenever she smiled, you smiled. Whenever she laughed, you laughed with her. And whenever she cried, your heart couldn't help but ache a little too. And that's a very rare quality. Because it isn't something you can teach. It's something that comes from who you are. I also think Audrey had an elegance that has very little to do with expensive clothes or famous designers. Yes, she wore some of the most beautiful fashions ever seen on screen. But I always think elegance isn't really about what we wear. It's about how we carry ourselves, how we treat other people, how we make people feel. And whenever I think about Audrey Hepburn, that is the elegance I remember most. The kindness, the grace, the quiet dignity. The feeling that she never needed to be the loudest person in the room to leave the biggest impression. And honestly, I think that's a lesson that's just important today, as it was all those years ago. As much as I admire Audrey Hepburn's films, I think what inspires me most happened long after the cameras stopped rolling. Because Audrey didn't simply spend her life entertaining people. She spent the later years of her life helping them. And the older I've become, the more I've found myself admiring that. Of course, success is wonderful, talent is wonderful. But choosing to use your voice to make somebody else's life a little better, well, I think that's something very special. And whenever I read about Audrey's humanitarian work, I'm reminded that she never really forgot what really mattered. She had experienced hardship herself as a little girl during the Second World War, so she knew what it was like to go without. She understood hunger, she understood fear, and perhaps that's why helping children meant so much to her. It wasn't simply charity, it came from the heart. And the more I learn about Audrey, the more I realise that kindness wasn't something she switched on whenever a camera appeared. It seemed to be woven into who she was. And I have to be honest, I think that's why she continues to inspire so many people today. Because genuine kindness never goes out of fashion. The world changes, fashion changes, films change, but compassion is timeless. And whenever I see photographs of Audrey visiting children around the world, I don't see a Hollywood legend. I simply see a woman who cared. A woman who understood that making people smile wasn't only something that happened on a cinema screen. Sometimes it happened through a kind word, a gentle smile, or simply taking the time to be there for somebody who needed it. And honestly, I believe that's the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind. Not simply being remembered, but being remembered for making the world a little kinder than you found it. And whenever I think about Audrey Hepburn, that's the woman I remember most. The more I've thought about this episode, the more I've realised that part of what I love isn't just Audrey itself. It's the world she represents. Now, before anyone misunderstands me, I don't mean the past was perfect. No era ever is. But there are certain things I love about the atmosphere of Audrey's films. The beautiful homes, the elegant fashion, the little cafes, the handwritten letters, the fresh flowers, and the quiet moments. And whenever I watch one of Audrey's films, I find myself looking at every little detail. The furniture, the lamps, the bookshelves, the china on the table, the beautiful dresses. The little touches that make those worlds feel so warm and inviting. And I know I'm not the only one who does that. Sometimes I find myself completely distracted by a room, or a beautiful chair, or a dress I'd happily wear. And I have to be honest, I think that's part of the magic. Because Audrey's films don't simply tell stories. They invite us into another world for a little while. A world where people seem to have time for one another. Where conversations aren't rushed. Where sitting down for a cup of tea with a friend feels important. Where beauty isn't about showing off. It's simply part of everyday life. And perhaps that's one of the reasons I've always felt so drawn to vintage films. Not because I want to live in the past, but because they remind me to slow down. To notice the little things. A bunch of flowers on the table. A handwritten note. A beautiful teacup. A conversation that isn't interrupted by a mobile phone. And I always think those little moments matter. And somehow, whenever I watch Audrey Hepburn, I'm reminded of all of them. And I think that's one of the reasons she continues to inspire me. She reminds me that elegance isn't complicated. Sometimes it's simply kindness, good manners, a warm smile, and appreciating the beauty that is already around us. And my goodness, I think the world could always do with a little more of that. Sometimes people assume that stars from the past only matter to the generation that grew up watching them. But I don't believe that's true for a second. In fact, I think Audrey Hepburn is just as inspiring today as she ever was. Perhaps even more so. We live in a world that often feels very busy, very loud, very fast. Everyone seems to be rushing somewhere, trying to keep up, trying to be noticed. And somehow, Audrey always reminds me there is another way to live. She reminds me that kindness doesn't need to be loud, that elegance doesn't need to demand attention, and that the most memorable people are often the ones who make others feel seen. And I think that's why she continues to capture the hearts of younger generations. Not because they wish they lived in the 1950s or 60s, but because they're searching for the same things people have always searched for. Warmth, grace, hope, kindness. Those things never stop being important. And whenever I see a young person discovering Audrey for the very first time, it always makes me smile. Because I know they're about to discover so much more than a wonderful actress. They're about to discover someone whose life reminds us that beauty fades, fashion changes, but character lasts forever. And I have to be honest, I think that's why Audrey has remained such an important part of my life. She reminds me that the greatest impression we leave on the world isn't through what we wear, or what we own, or even what we achieve. It's through the way we treat other people. And honestly, I think that's one of the most beautiful lessons Audrey Hepburn ever left behind. And honestly, my lovely friends, I think that's why Audrey Hepburn continues to inspire me all these years later. Not simply because she was beautiful, although she certainly was. Not simply because she was a wonderful actress, although she certainly was. But because she showed us that true elegance comes from something much deeper. Kindness, grace, compassion, humility. And those are the things I think of whenever I think about Audrey. Whenever I watch one of her films, I don't simply find myself admiring the beautiful clothes or the glamorous settings. I find myself admiring the woman. A woman who never seemed to lose sight of what really mattered. Someone who used her success to bring happiness to others. Someone who never forgot the importance of kindness. And someone who proved that you don't have to be the loudest person in the room to leave the biggest impression. And whenever I watch Audrey Hepburn, I always come away feeling just a little bit happier. A little more calmer. A little more hopeful. And I have to be honest, I think that's a very rare gift. Because long after the fashions change, long after the trends come and go, long after the new stars appear, people are still discovering Audrey. People are still falling in love with her films. And people are still being inspired by the beautiful examples she left behind. And that's something incredibly special. So thank you so much for spending a little time with me today, my lovely friends. I'd love to know in the comments what Audrey Hepburn means to you. Do you have a favourite film? A favourite moment? Or perhaps there's something about Audrey that has always inspired you too? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts. Until next time, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and keep a little old-fashioned magic in your heart. I'll see you all again very soon.